So, like it or not, we're probably going to assess somebody's performance by asking people about it. Judgmental performance measures are assessments of an employee's performance from the perspective of one or more people in the organization. So for the rest of the video, we'll consider two questions with regard to judgmental measures. First, who does the rating? And second, how do we get those ratings? So, who rates an employee? The most common source, as you might expect, is one's supervisor. That makes sense. But who else might provide performance ratings in addition to the supervisor? Well, your coworkers or peers can provide evidence about your performance. If you're a manager, your subordinates can rate you. Customers and clients even can rate you. We often see those "how am I doing" sorts of cards at restaurants. And you can rate yourself. In fact, one approach to judgmental performance measures is to collect data from multiple sources. This is sometimes called multi-source feedback. Judgmental measures can take a number of forms. The most common and broad category is the graphic rating scale. This is any type of scale that asks the respondent to give ratings on a continuum, usually for multiple dimensions of performance. The Likert type scale that we're all familiar with is an example of a graphic rating scale, but there are many other ways to structure the same type of rating. Let's take a quick look. As you can see, there are many ways to present a graphic rating scale. They can vary in terms of how large the scale is, how many numbers are involved, how detailed the information provided is, or whether the scale is more image-based or numerical. We don't see it here, but a common flaw in many rating scales is that they ask the rater to judge a worker's traits rather than the worker's performance. Both industrial psychologists and counselors know that focusing on who the person is rather than the behavior they engage in is not the most helpful or even accurate way to provide feedback for developmental purposes. So it's important to structure these such that they focus on behavior and not on traits. A second approach is to compare employees to one another. The simplest version of this involves judging who is performing better between each pair of employees. So Sam and David, which one is performing better? And if you do this for all the employees, this produces a rank order of employee performance from low to high. Of course, you can also break performance down into multiple dimensions such as work quality, time management, and so on. This can get tedious with large groups, so for example, if you had 10 employees and you rated them on just 5 dimensions, it would require making 225 ratings, which would definitely take a long time. One version of this approach that was recently popular is the force distribution rating scale. In a force distribution rating scale, each employee gets an overall grade for their performance, but the percentage of employees who get each type of grade is preset by the organization. This system is similar to grading on a curve, where there will be a certain percentage of A's, B's, C's, and so on. Let's take a look at an example. In 2000, Ford Motor Company introduced an ABC system for evaluating its managers. The top 10% would get a rating of A, the middle 80% would get a rating of B, and the bottom 10% would get a rating of C. And those who got 2 C ratings 2 years in a row would be terminated or demoted. Other companies have used this as well, as including IBM, Hewlett-Packard, GE, Sun Microsystems, Cisco, and Enron, everybody's favorite corporation. Enron actually called this approach rank and yank. How do you think that managers who were being evaluated under the system felt about the approach? Well, they didn't like it at all. They argued that it meant that some people would be guaranteed to get a failing review, even if everybody was performing well. Ultimately, Ford removed this system and had to pay $10 million in a settlement with those who sued the company, who argued that the system also led to age, race, and gender discrimination. Given that employees dislike this approach so much, why do you think that companies find this approach appealing? Well, here's what Jack Welch, the longtime CEO of GE, said about it. So his argument is that there will always be underperforming people in your organization, and you just have to keep cutting them away to keep your organization healthy. In addition, some upper management liked this approach because it kept raters from being too lenient while going through the performance appraisal process. Just as a side note, there's some evidence that these sorts of practices might be resulting in increased performance pressure. A longitudinal study by the University of Michigan asked workers whether they have to work very hard on their jobs and whether they feel like they never have enough time to get their work done. As we can see, there are increases in the proportion of employees who responded yes to both of these questions between 1977 and 2002. A forced distribution system would likely exacerbate these feelings. The final type of judgmental measure that we'll look at is behavior-focused rating forms. These are what they sound like. They're rating forms that focus on employee behavior more than the other ones tend to do. The most well-known of these is called the Behaviorally Anchored Rating Scale, which is hard to say unless you use the acronym BARS. Let's take a look. Here's an example of a BARS scale for a job of police officer. There's one rating scale for each dimension, and here we can see in the upper left that this dimension is job knowledge. The scale is a 10-point scale, which I've broken into 2 slides so you can see it more clearly. This is the top part of the slide. It looks like a graphic rating scale, but the difference is that along the continuum, left and right, we can see example behaviors that the employee might exhibit. At the top are examples of a high level of performance. You can see on the middle left there. Could be expected to follow correct procedures for evidence preservation at the scene of a crime. This is the bottom half of the scale, and you can see examples of low performance. Behavior that would be indicative of a very low level of job knowledge would be this one on the bottom left. Could be expected to misinform public on legal matters through lack of knowledge. Yikes. The idea is that by providing behavioral examples sprinkled throughout the rating form, people who are doing the rating will be more reliable because they have a set of reference points, as opposed to each person deciding for themselves what a 4 means or a 5 means. Now, developing a BARS scale is actually quite involved, and it can take a lot of time and effort to come up with all these behavioral examples. The good news is that it forces us to focus on what performance actually means for that position, and it tends to enhance feelings of fairness because the employees themselves are often involved in the creation of these scales. So, to wrap up, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using judgmental approaches to measuring performance? Well, the good news is that you can measure anything by asking people about it. Even though they'll be subjective, you can cover pretty much any aspect of performance just by writing questions that people respond to. We don't have that deficiency problem that we saw with the objective measures. And the data you get from raters can be actually quite rich, especially if you include not only ratings but also allow for open-ended questions. Faculty usually find the written comments on SCIs much more helpful than the ratings themselves. And now I guess they're typed comments instead of written comments, but you understand what I mean. On the negative side, anytime people make judgments about other people, there's a potential for biases of all kinds. Anything from inaccurate memory to stereotyping to a tendency to only give high or low ratings. But that's for another time. For now, thanks for watching and have a good day.